Okay. And start. All right, let's get started. First, I have to tell you that sitting down to write the three talks that I had to do this week, the first several days were spent looking at Google Slides templates, mostly because I love wasting time and procrastinating, and I was intimidated about actually writing all the talks. So I spent days just looking through really bad templates, and then I saw this. And I knew that at least one of the three talks had to have this spirit, deer, and magic forest template. It was very important. And I thought that it was pretty gay, and so it became the template for playing queer characters. So welcome, all of you. I hope you enjoy the Google Slides template and also a little bit my talk. So my name's Avery Alder. I've been designing tabletop role-playing games for the past 16 years. Oh, I'm nervous. There's a lot of you here. Okay. I've been designing tabletop role-playing games for the last 16 years. Most of that has been independent, solo, and self-published. I've designed a number of games: Monster Hearts, Dream Askew, The Quiet Year, Ribbon Drive, a list of other small projects. And a lot of the games that I have made kind of keep returning to a couple specific themes. And I wrote here identity, community, and the collapse of civilization. I think the other ones are doubt and self-exploration and queerness and queer community. And so it's those last few that really are why I'm giving this talk today. So we're going to talk about a couple things today. First of all, what it means to play queer characters and to play with queerness at the table. Second, I want to talk about who queer characters and queer stories are for. Who should be telling these stories? Who should be playing these games? And then third, I wanted to talk a little bit about the closet and what the closet means for role-playing. So the first of those three questions, how do you play queerness? And I'm approaching this presentation today not from the perspective that queerness means being lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender, but that queerness is also about a political position in the world, about a social position in the world. Queerness is not just those specific sexual or gender identities, but about what it means to live on the margins of society, to be living outside of social expectations and boundaries or of one form or another. So queerness, to me at least, has political dimensions. So with that in mind, how do you play queerness? 3 words came to me in particular, and the first was flux. So queer people rarely have an easy time of figuring out their own queerness. No, I'm not going to ask for a show of hands, but I just believe that there are a bunch of you in the audience who are queer and who had a long, complicated, messy process of figuring out what that meant for you. Queerness often is engaged in processes of doubt, of discovering and then intentionally forgetting or burying or pressing down and having it resurface and come back up and having to confront it again, of figuring out what to hide from yourself and from others, what to expose to yourself and to others. So queerness is often in flux within us as individuals. And even when it's not, even when it's like, oh yeah, I totally understand myself and my body and my sexual identity. I've got that on lock. No complications there. It's still true that that queerness is in flux within the world, right? That we are engaged in a society that doesn't have a place for us, that is uncertain if it wants to make a place for us. So to me, when we talk about playing queer characters, that's a matter of playing characters that are in flux internally and externally. The second thing that really comes to mind is context. That what it means to be queer in one culture, in one time, is going to be really different than what it means to be queer somewhere else and someone else. And so to me, queerness is really a contextual thing. And so when we're telling queer stories, when we're sitting down at the table and playing queer characters, it's not enough to just think about, for example, what it means to be gay in Helsinki, and then just apply that to being an elf in the future in space. Queerness needs to be found anew within every genre, within every world, within every story, and within every storyteller. So I want to talk a little bit about that world thing. If we are playing in a fantasy game that has a fantasy setting where lesbian and gay characters are fully accepted and integrated within the fabric of society, where they are not rejected or outcast, where they are not judged or discriminated against, that's a different world than the one we live in. And I think it's important to challenge yourselves as world builders and as kind of imaginers to ask, like, what does it mean to play queer characters within this society? And are we playing those characters who are accepted? Are we exploring what it means to be gay and accepted? Or are we playing characters who exist on different margins? Is queerness a different dimension of society there? Do we find the different way of being outcast and othered and play those characters? I think both can be correct answers, but they're really different answers, right? So to me, playing queer characters is about exploring contexts. Queerness doesn't exist within a vacuum. It exists within time, a place, a culture, a world, in stories that exist within a genre. And the third thing I think about is the gravity of queerness for these characters. I think that when we tell stories about queer characters, sometimes it's important to have their queerness be incidental, right? This is a powerful space captain who is belligerent and who is, all these different interesting character traits. Oh, and by the way, they happen to be gay. Like sometimes it's really good to tell stories where people are incidentally gay. Sometimes it's really great to tell stories where those characters, their queerness matters and is central to the story, and the story is about their queerness, and it revolves around their queerness. I don't think we want to do that every time, because we don't want to pigeonhole queer characters into stories that are only ever about the complexities of queerness. But at the same time, we don't want to treat these queer characters like they're just like everyone else, because queer people are not just like everyone else, right? Our lives and our experiences are different. They're different in different ways for each of us. But so I think it's important to kind of remember when we're playing queer characters that we should be entertaining that range between characters whose queerness is incidental to the story, all the way through to characters whose queerness is the story. And we'll have some discussion later, and I can find out whether you vibe with those 3 points or if there's any other points or other words that come to mind that maybe I missed here. But to me, when I think about playing queer characters, these are 3 kind of dimensions or factors that really come to mind: flux and context and gravity. Yesterday, I gave a talk about my design career, and we talked about queer games in that as well. And one of the questions that came up, someone asked, as a straight woman, should I play lesbian characters? And this is a question that I think is really common. A lot of the time people ask, am I allowed to play queer characters? Am I supposed to play queer characters? How do I be respectful in doing that? And that question isn't asked of people only about queerness. My friends who are game designers and game players who are people of color get this question a lot. Am I allowed to play a black character? Am I allowed to play an Asian character? Should I? Why should I? Why should I want to? These are, I think, really tricky questions. But when it comes to queerness, part of my answer starts with the fact that queerness defies boundaries, and that queerness doesn't benefit from the establishment of binaries, of you can't do this and I can do this. Queerness is about resisting and recontextualizing and reimagining boundaries. And so my answer always starts that queer characters are for everyone who is committed to exploring these themes in earnesty, and exploring these themes not just within a fictional character, but also within themselves. My answer to that woman yesterday was that she should start playing lesbian characters because she doesn't realize that she's a lesbian yet. And I say that flippantly, but also kind of genuinely, because that is actually how I discovered a lot of my own queerness, was sitting down to the table with the assumption that I was sitting down to the table as a straight boy who just happened to be playing a woman character again, or who just happened to be playing a gay character again. And it was only through playing repeatedly and exploring these different dimensions of characters that I started to slowly self-reflect on what these characters that I'm playing might say about me. So the first reason that I say that queer characters are for everyone is just that playing queer characters is a site where people can begin to explore the possibility of their own queerness. And I think that's really just amazing and valuable. I have a quote here from Catherine Cross. Catherine Cross is a trans feminist games scholar, and she's writing about her experiences playing World of Warcraft. And she said that this game, World of Warcraft, showed an illumined path to accepting my womanhood in the real world. Each click on the keyboard brought me one step closer to loving myself. And later in that same article, she writes, the game provided an experimental virtual world where I could practice resisting patriarchy from the subjectivity of a strong, proud woman. the World of Warcraft designers didn't intend for this to happen, that it would be a transsexual awakening experience for anybody. But that's part of the power of games, is that when we sit down to play them, it doesn't actually matter what the designer intended. What we discover there is going to be personal and experimental and weird, because we're going to tell stories that are personal and experimental and weird. And part of the beauty of that is that we can then choose what we do with those experiences. Those experiences we have at the table, those fake memories, we can just get up and walk away from the table. We can say, cool, that was a fun and interesting fiction, and then we can get up and go for a coffee and never think about it again. And that permission to just leave it at the table if we want to allows us to go deeper in the exploration, because it's just a game. And then at the end, we get to check in with ourselves and ask, like, was it really just a game? Am I really leaving this at the table? Or is this character a mirror that I'm holding up to myself? And if so, why? So I said I think that playing queer characters is for everyone, and that everyone should approach that as a means to explore that possibility of queerness within themselves. But there's also, I think, a risk, right? There's a risk of appropriation. There's a risk of building false understandings of other people's experiences. There's a risk of getting it wrong or doing harm or perpetuating stereotypes. And so there's a question of how you do that ethically and how you do that right. And I found an article by James Mendez Hodes. Mendez is a really brilliant game designer, game player, and cultural consultant. And he wrote these questions within the context of a similar question of, like, should white people play characters of color? Which I think is a different question, but a question that has some parallels, obviously, here. And what I really love about Mendez's response, which was a blog post that was written a few years ago that is well worth tracking down and reading in full. But what I really loved about Mendez's response was that it wasn't a binary, it wasn't a black and white, it wasn't a this is right and this is wrong. Instead, it was a question of, like, yeah, that sounds potentially really fruitful. Why are you doing that? What are you hoping to get out of it? What are you worried about? Why are you worried about that? What are you going to be curious about at the end of this process? And so it was an answer that didn't shut the door, but opened it wider. And so some of these questions that Mendez asked in that blog post that I want to highlight here. When you're thinking about playing a character who is different from yourself, who is other from yourself, especially a character who is marginalized in ways that you are not marginalized, there are these questions. Who has the power? Who's vulnerable to harm? Where are the patterns? What's the context? How does it make you feel? I really love that question of what's the context, because a lot of the time when we are playing role-playing games, we are sitting down at a table with maybe, 3, 4, 5 people. Oh, you're all from the Nordic countries. You don't play at tabletops, you do LARPs. So you're standing around in the woods with, 50, 60 people? But it's a small enclosed space with trusted people. And you've kind of built that magic circle to act within. And so that's actually a really great place to make mistakes and to screw up, because the repercussions and the ripples into the real world are relatively limited. And when we're talking about questions of representation and justice and ethics and boundaries and what our place in the world is, we're going to make a bunch of mistakes. We're going to screw up a whole bunch. That's part of the learning process. And so if that is true, then I think making those mistakes in a place where it's relatively easy to catch ourselves, to learn from that, to adjust and reiterate and try and get it better the next time, I think is really important. And so part of what I really loved about this article that I'm mentioning by Mendez was the assertion that it's a good thing to trust yourself, to be able to recover from mistakes. All of this to say, I think that playing queer characters is for everyone, and I think who you are when you sit down at that table informs how you should play those queer characters. if you're queer yourself and you're playing a character who is very similar to yourself, you have different responsibilities to that character than you would if you're sitting down as a straight person who's like, this is my first time ever trying to play a woman, let alone a lesbian. You have responsibilities to that character and to that table, and they're different from person to person. So we talked a little bit about what goes into playing a queer character and who should play queer characters. And those two topics were like really well integrated, I think. And now I don't have a convenient segue to get to this third topic. So it's just going to be a jarring switch. But we're going to talk a little bit about the idea of the closet, because I think it is really relevant to talking about queer role-playing and role-playing queer characters. So are people generally familiar with that expression, the closet? The idea of being trapped in the closet, coming out of the closet. And we tend to talk about it in really negative terms, right? Being trapped, coming out, being really important in terms of escaping. But there's this question of like, well, how did all these queer people get into all these queer closets in the first place? Which leads me to ask, like, what happens inside the closet? And I think the answer is that what happens inside of that closet is that it is a place of safe exploration. I wrote here, the closet allows us to imagine, to try things on, to feel into possibility, and to be safe in our experiments. We go into the closet because that's where all the really pretty dresses that we're not allowed to wear are. And we go in there to wear them. And if we think about that, conceptualization of the closet as like a safe place to experiment, to mess around, to explore, to imagine, to dream, I think that starts to draw a really close parallel to what we have in games, what's often called the magic circle. Right? When we sit down at a table to do role-playing, we're suddenly invited to imagine and to dream in a relatively private space. Right? We've got those 3 to 5 people around a table. We've got those 50 to 60 people with pointy ears out in the woods, and it's just us. And we get to try out being someone new. There's this quote I found from Nancy Uden, who's a journalist who was writing an article interviewing 5 queer people of color, I think from America, talking about what the closet means to each of them and inviting them to kind of reimagine what the closet is. And for queer people of color, I think there's an additional kind of layer of complexity and tension in terms of like what the closet is, because often they are navigating belonging to multiple marginalized communities, right? To queer communities and also to migrant communities, to ethnic communities, and often those communities can find themselves at tension. And so the closet becomes a really important strategic location for them. Compartmentalizing and moving between different layers of their own identities becomes a really important survival tool. That's true for all queer people, but it's especially true, I think, for the people who Nancy Uden was interviewing in this article. And I wanted to share this quick quote from her. She wrote that reframing the narrative about the closet allows people to complicate their experiences on their own terms and strategically invite others to their spaces of comfort. And that idea of strategically inviting others to their spaces of comfort felt really resonant in terms of what we do when we role play. And part of what's really cool about role playing is that we can continue to evaluate how much we're going to be doing that strategic inviting throughout the course of play. And so I might sit down at a convention table with any random 4 of you and be giving a little bit of myself, right? Be revealing a little bit of my vulnerable inner baby. And we'll just see how that goes. And maybe an hour in, I start to open up more. My character's story gets a little bit more weird, a little bit more vulnerable. And I can kind of just feel out that process with you all. So yeah, that strategic inviting of others into a space of comfort is part of what occurs within the magic circle of games. It's what occurs within that safe exploration that can take place in the closet. The reason we go into the closet in the first place. So bringing this back to role-playing games and to LARP, I wanted to share a quote by Janaya Kemper. I saw some applause hands. So Janaya is a LARP scholar based out of America, but who has been connected with the Nordic LARP community for quite a while. Has Janaya Kemper been here to Ropecon? I didn't hear that answer, but
not in Ropecon. She's been in Finland, but not in Ropecon.
How rude. Here's this quote from Janaya, and it's talking about the idea of weirding oneself. And she writes, "To be weird is to be outside the normal aspects of society, yes, but to also collectively decide who you would like to be, not based on societal pressure. It is my belief that LARP affords us the actual ability to weird ourselves, that is, to shape ourselves and our conceptions of self through play." So I think this is a really powerful force. And like I mentioned earlier, I think part of its power comes from the fact that we are not obligated to shape ourselves based on the outcomes of play. We are instead invited to. It's an opt-in experience, and that's part of what allows us to kind of push those boundaries in terms of where we go with our characters. And that can be really, really fruitful. It can allow us to push further than we might otherwise, because we have this little pretense of it's just a story, it's just a fiction, it's just a game. And that alibi creates kind of permission to go deeper. So I mentioned this idea, what if the closet's good, actually? But obviously, it's only good, actually, if we have the ability to enter it on our own terms and leave it on our own terms. All right, here, the closet is only a gift if we are able to overcome shame and risk in order to bring queerness back out of it. If the role-playing game table that we sit down at is the only place where we feel safe to explore our queerness, the only place where we can develop these identities, and then they have to stay at the table, then we lose a lot of that magic. And so I think one of the things that really stood out in that Catherine Cross quote that I shared earlier was that she talked about how the game also gave her a chance to practice resisting patriarchy through this subjectivity of a strong, independent woman, something along those lines. And I think that is part of the answer to this. Like, how do we take what we develop in the closet back out with us? I think when we're talking about queer role-playing and playing queer characters, we also need to talk about the context of that larger role-playing game community, right? What are our convention organizers and our game runners and our kind of wider social infrastructure that we're building together doing to support people in the return of that journey? And I felt really delighted to witness a lot of the ways that Ropecon is doing that work to support that coming back out from the game safely and into welcoming arms. And so that's been really, really lovely. But I think this is a question that I continue to wonder about. I know that going into that magic circle of the game, going into that closet of safe exploration, playing queer characters, that can be really transformative. But not everyone feels safe bringing those experiences with them. And so I think this is part of the challenge that we have as a community, is figuring out what we can do to support both sides of that journey. The going into the weird, but also bringing the weird back out with us. We've left lots of time for conversation and questions. My name's Avery Alder. I publish games. They're available on the website buriedwithoutceremony.com. Thank you so much for letting me share these thoughts and open up this question for all of us. I believe we have a second mic to be passed around the room for questions. Alternately, that could be wrong and I could be holding it.
Oh,
I saw this microphone on YouTube videos from previous years, and I'm really hopeful we get to throw it around.
Do we have any technical issues?
Does that microphone there work? That one does.
It does, and so we can pass this one around.
Nice.
Bring this around.
All right, let's start with the microphone here. I see a question here, and then a third question right here.
Thank you so much for the presentation. Very quick question. In what circumstances do you think we should play straight characters?
In the future, when everyone is gay, and we don't remember what it was like to be amongst straight people, then we should play straight characters so that we can remember what those long ago ancient people were like.
Hi, thank you for a wonderful talk. One thing you talked about was responsibility while playing queer characters, and I was wondering if you would be willing to expand on that a little bit. The thing that I'm thinking about is sort of who are you responsible for when you are playing tabletop RPGs with queer topics? Sort of who is the reference that you are responsible for?
Yeah, so I think this is a complicated question. I tend to think about responsibility in terms of what we portray in stories as a kind of a set of concentric rings. And this is when we play not only queer characters, but when we play characters that explore any kind of identity or any kind of complicated or really serious, heavy theme. I think, first of all, we have a responsibility to ourselves to be safe in what we explore, to not trigger ourselves, to not go farther than what we're actually going to be able to handle in terms of what we portray, and to being authentic and honest to ourselves and our own understanding of the world. So we have that layer of responsibility. And then I think this is maybe the most important one, is we have that responsibility to the people at the table. So especially if I'm sitting down as a white person at a table where there are people of multiple races, and I'm portraying a character who's a person of color, I feel like the responsibility that I am most concerned about is to those 3 or 4 people at the table with me. Because how I portray that character, it could leave them feeling misunderstood. It could leave them feeling like I'm just perpetuating stereotypes that have harmed them their whole lives. So I have a responsibility to those people at that table. And then also, part of what we do when we tell stories is that we reinforce an understanding of how the world works. Those stories will shape how we see the world and how we act within the world, the real world. Even if we're telling stories about space elves far in the future, we're still ultimately training ourselves to believe certain things about the world that we live in today. And so I think we have a responsibility to the people we portray, to use the stories we tell about them to strengthen our support and connection to them. Have I worded that sentence well? Probably not, but hopefully you catch my drift. And I think that maybe lastly, we have a responsibility when we play characters who are not like ourselves to not get trapped in a false sense of empathy, where we think, yes, I now know what it is like to be gay. I now know what it is like to be disabled, right? Whatever the case might be. So we have a responsibility to leave a role-playing game with more curiosity than answers.
Thank you.
And we had a question here, and then more.
Thank you. I have not such a question, but as a thought and a passage that the hard thing is also the surrounding context when you are playing a queer character or a gay character or a lesbian character, for example. And there is a very hard to keep the balance with, because the LARP community, the board gamers community is in the West really supporting And for example, when you are doing some games about some word house or conversion therapy or something like that, people are expecting, who are playing gay characters are expecting to suffer, or their characters to suffer, for example, and the other players who are managed to be the, I don't know, doctors or something like that, are managed to treat them, and they not, because the players, not the characters, are not allowed in their minds to do it. And it's too hard to keep the balance between the real triggers, the in-game triggers, and to have a good game, but to not upset anyone, and etc. That's not a question, that's just thoughts.
Yeah,
Out.
no, it's a really important thought. I think one of the most important parts of any role-playing game is the snack break that you take in the middle, because it gives you a chance to just check in with people and to see how they're feeling out of character, right? To like get up and stretch your legs, get some water, and to look around and see like, now that we're like out of character for a second, are these people still agitated? So I think that like pausing sometimes to check in with people is really important. I think communication is, I think, the other element of that responsibility, right? But it's complicated. You also mentioned, I think, that often people will gravitate towards playing queer characters when we're talking about like a tragedy story. And like similar to that question of gravity, I think it's also important to like not just look to play marginalized characters when we're telling stories about suffering, but also play marginalized characters when we're telling stories about being really cool badasses or living in a really wonderful utopia, right? And so we get that kind of breadth of what it might mean to be queer in a story. But yeah, thank you so much for that kind of observation. All right, we have a few more minutes. Are there more questions or thoughts? We have one right here.
Yeah, what would be some good queer games we should play? Some ready-made games with queer stories in them, if we don't want to make them ourselves our own games?
I would like to direct you to buriedwithoutceremony.com. No, but honestly, there's some really wonderful games. If you're looking for a game that is still like a fun action adventure game where your characters are swashbuckling and triumphing over villains, Thirsty Sword Lesbians by April Walsh, published by Evil Hat Games, is a really wonderful one. If you're looking for games about gay people who are sad and have too many doubts and feelings, buriedwithoutceremony.com has a number of those. I really love all of the work by Possum Creek Games through Yaziba's Bed and Breakfast and also Wander Home. They've done a really good job of exploring queer stories about that are just like slice of life, cute, rambling countryside kind of stories that feature queer characters in a bunch of different ways. So those are, I think, some starting points that I would recommend. Oh, and if you are looking for something that is like really serious, really poignant, really beautiful, a 1 or 2 player game, We Write Private Cathedrals by Sam Roswell is a really small game that is about 2 queer lovers writing letters in a time when they know that a lot of those letters won't make it to the other person or won't be safe to say what they want to say because we live in an age of censorship. And so that one is a really beautiful, heartbreaking small game. So that's, I think, my short list. And I think we have time for maybe one more question. Right in the back there.
Thank you for your presentation. It was amazing. And my question is, what do you think about queer phobia in a campaign setting? Is it realistic, or would you leave it out completely?
That's a really good question. I think that realism is the least important thing to attend to in that situation. I think the most important thing to attend to is what the people at the table will feel safe and comfortable exploring. And the next most important thing to attend to is what the players at the table would find interesting and compelling to explore. And it's pretty far down the list before you get to realism and verisimilitude before I am interested in exploring those topics. I've played games with queer people who are like, I don't want to play games about queer people suffering. I already experienced that in my daily life. I want to play games that are about queer people succeeding and connecting and loving one another and experiencing beauty and joy. And I say, that's great. I'm going to put my games away and we'll take out someone else's. And I've also played games with queer people where they have said, like, I want to play a character who has been gay bashed and is experiencing trauma, and that is what their story is about. Are you okay with that? And that's a process of checking in with the table and asking, like, do we want to go there? Do we feel safe going there? Do we want to go there? And then that realism question of how do we portray that in an authentic way, that comes after those other two questions in my mind. All right, thank you all so much for being here, for asking these really lovely questions. This is a really full room, and that's really exciting. And yeah, I look forward to seeing you all around the convention hall.